appears to me sometimes, Jordan, that anthropology and ethnographics suggest that we ought live in manageable communities where the kind of narcissism and sadism that you describe cannot thrive because of the way that relationships break down when you encounter personalities of that type. There is no ability to regulate a culture at this kind of scale. And I know that what you believe in, it seems at least to me, that you believe in new ways of decentralizing power, both corporate and state. I wonder, are you saying something as significant as the nation project has had its demi-millennia and that it's time to review even the findings and the treasures of the Westphalian Treaty? Is this a time where we review the way that we organize cultures and society? Because it appears to me that the reason that we have these great gargoyles and demons occupying the public stage, vivid caricatures, a vile, lurid and pornographic language, even outside of the erotic, is precisely because we are living in some outgrowth, in some exaggeration, in some unbearable amplification of the type of systems that we might live by. Industrialization, it seems, ultimately introduced a great deal of tyranny, as well as the miracles it delivered. Agriculture, perhaps the same could be said, but we have no contingency for the problems of scale that have been created by this new type of technology. And it seems to me that unless we introduce real measures, as you say, control mechanisms, that the tyranny now is appearing to be inevitable without significant and organized opposition.
Okay, so one of the things you said at the beginning of that was that when you extract relationships out of their local environment, you lose a regulatory function. You lose an implicit regulatory function. So imagine that, you and I have had multiple opportunities to communicate. And one of the things, and we want to sustain that. So one of the things that we do while we're communicating, we might be trying to make our individual points for our own particular purposes. Hopefully, we're trying to do something like investigate the truth, mutually. But in any case, even if our own personal interests did creep into that, if we had any sense, our exchanges would be bounded by the realization that we're going to interact repeatedly for an indefinite amount of time into the future, right? And so that makes us instantly, the dyad that we form, that makes us instantly into an interacting and iterative community. Now, I believe that it's out of iterative interactions that fundamental morality emerges. And there's plenty of game theory that indicates precisely that. Now, see what happens to psychopaths and predators and parasites is that they sacrifice the possibility of a long-term relationship for immediate gratification. And that's not good for them, by the way, because they tend to be very unsuccessful people and they have to move from victim to victim very rapidly because people cotton onto their games. But they're not bounded by that necessity of responsible, iterated interaction, the same necessity that would govern you if you were in a long-term committed relationship or the relationship that you have with your children. And it's out of that that morality springs. Now, if you eradicate that necessity, you disinhibit the psychopaths now, and the predators and the parasites. Now, here's why this is such a major problem, and it might be a deadly problem. So the biological struggle is an arms race between parasites and hosts, and always has been. And it's such a profound race that's why sex evolved. Sex evolved because there are creatures that replicate, even some lizards that can replicate essentially by cloning themselves. So they produce identical duplicates of themselves. But what happens is the parasites can optimize for their physiology and take them out. So sex mixes genes. Okay, so the reason I'm saying that is because the parasite problem is so deep and so profound that sex itself evolved as the method of replication to deal with it. Now, the online communication systems facilitate the parasites. And you don't need that many of them to take a society down, like the real radical types who would rather dance around in the chaos and who are in it only for their immediate self-gratification. They're a very small percentage of the population. Clinical data indicates about 3%. But the problem with that is that if they have free rein, they can take everything down. Like they did that in the Russian Revolution, for example. This happens.
Do you sense in identity politics a further fetishization of individualism that can no longer really be sustained? That rationalism has brought us to this point where all of our functions tend to be predicated on the service of our preferences and our aversions, that our individual likes and dislikes become our Quran, they become our religion. And do you feel, Jordan, that partly what you are trying to do is reintroduce transcendent spiritual ideas to a cultural conversation that is bereft in them and is framed only really within the lexicon of materialism and the tropes of post-enlightenment philosophy that really doesn't embrace mysticism the way that perhaps it could? And within this idea around identity politics and it being a kind of the ultimate celebration of the individual, that it has baked into it kind of is preventative of unity almost in the way that it defines itself. Could you also touch upon this attack perhaps on nature's self, and within that masculinity? I know it's an idea you've talked about extensively, but in relation to identity politics in particular.
Okay, so interesting. It's very interesting, Russell. One of the things that Carl Jung intimated near the end of the Second World War was that the fundamental danger of Protestantism as such was the continual fragmentation of the religious enterprise. And you see this with the multiplication of Protestant sects, let's say. And he thought that the ultimate extension of that would be that each individual, in some sense, would become their own church. And so when God identifies himself to Moses in Exodus, he says, I am that I am, or I am what I am. He identifies himself as the principle of being and becoming itself. All right. Now, if you identify reality with your subjective experience only, you attribute to yourself that quality. I am the ultimate arbiter of what constitutes reality. But there's a weird twist in that, and it's one that I don't exactly understand, because the subjectivity to which all things are to be subordinated tends to be allied with an extremely narrow hedonism. And so the people who are pushing forward an identity politics seem to identify their own individuality with nothing more, let's say, than their immediate sexual desire. And I would say sexual particularly because so much of identity politics is about sexual attraction. And then you might say, well, it's a pretty strange theory of human existence that you are to be identified with one biological whim, let's say. And the unity that you're describing, I don't even think in some sense is metaphysical or transcendent. I think what it is the hammering into a higher order unity of the plethora of fundamental motivational and emotional systems that would otherwise manifest themselves as a pure local subjectivity. And if that happens, you run into the psychopath problem. Like if you're only out, let's say you identify yourself with your desires, your immediate desires. Well, then you're going to treat everyone around you and yourself like a means to the gratification of those immediate desires. And what that will do is that'll destroy you in the future because you're not giving your future self any allowance. You do terrible things now because they're pleasurable, regardless of consequences. And you treat everyone else as if they're lesser and subordinate to your whims. This higher unity, it isn't less real than the subordinate whims. It's more real. Like the hero archetype is the most real representation of the human self. It's the most real. And it's based on the idea of something approximating courageous self-sacrifice. So, for example, you see in the dragon fight story, the notion that you have to confront what you're terrified of and repelled by. You have to do that voluntarily. The more assiduously you pursue that, the bigger the treasure you garner. If you garner the treasure, you're obligated to distribute it generously to the community. And it's all of that that makes up that central archetype of the hero. And that is the central unity, right? That unites the individual internally, unites motivation and emotion, and then unites each individual with the community.
A sense that the hero cannot be mobilized or galvanized without that motivation, that the fuel doesn't arrive until the hero it transcends from egoic motivation to communal motivation. That when fueled by the ego, you cannot confront the dragon.